Hello and welcome to this Philbert Flies review of UK2000's Glasgow 2020HD scenery for Microsoft Flight Simulator. You join me as I fly an approach to runway 23, and I'm starting with an approach to give you a look at the surrounding area and the opportunity to gauge the performance of this add-on on my computer. You can find my system specs and current graphics settings in the description down below. I'm also showing you this approach to point out a problem with the ILSs at this airport. You'll notice that the aircraft fails to capture the localizer properly, despite it being shown correctly on the PFD. I've tried this approach in the stock 787 and I found the same issue, and I also tried some approaches to other airports in the A320 just in case it was a problem with the latest version of the mod, but these were all fine. So this does seem to be an issue with this particular airport. It's probably an issue with the default nav data rather than one of UK2000's making, but it's certainly something that needs addressing. The approach in the opposite direction to runway 05 has the same problem. Anyway, enough said for now. I'll let you watch the approach and landing in peace, and I'll speak to you again when we're parked up at a gate, from where we'll explore the scenery in different weather and lighting conditions. Welcome to Glasgow. We are parked up at gate 24. There are a combination of default jetways and custom 2-axis jetways at this airport. This is one of the latter, and unfortunately they're not operational in this scenery. Additionally, when you spawn at one of these gates, the aircraft is set back a fair way from the terminal, so the jetway is nowhere near being aligned with the aircraft door. Both these things are disappointing, as there are both cheaper payware airports and freeware airports that have working 2-axis jetways and start you off with your aircraft correctly aligned. The default jetways do of course attach as they should, and they're a pretty good match for the real jetways at Glasgow. All the gates have ground services available. Anyway, that's the end of my longest ever jetway chat. I think it's time to move on to having a look at the modelling and texturing of the airport's buildings, starting with the domestic pier that we're parked at the moment. Almost all of the windows at this airport rely on opaque textures as opposed to being transparent and having modelled interiors behind them. I think the textures used are actually quite nice looking. They certainly are images of a terminal interior, but the resolution lets them down. You'll notice when we get closer with the drone that there is quite a lot of blurriness and a little bit of aliasing and anomalies on some of the edges. You'll also notice that the window textures here seem to bend in at the bottom, which is a little bit of a shame. Beneath the windows, again, we've got some quite nice textures which are let down by their resolution. I really like the rust on this shutter, for example, but both this and the brickwork look very blurry. The upper parts of the jetway make use of transparent glass, and there's quite a convincing floor texture inside. The windows are slightly tinted, and they retain their tint from the inside as well, which is good to see. Unfortunately, however, there's no door at the top of them, so there's no way to get inside the terminal, which is a little bit of an immersion killer. The east pier is done to a similar standard. The quality of the modelling here is pretty good, and the textures don't look too bad at all from a distance, but again they are let down slightly by their resolution, and there are one or two little anomalies here and there. That said, some of the details included look really nice. I like the signage, I like these traffic cones down here, we have an animated ramp worker which is nice, and some other ground clutter that you wouldn't necessarily see at a lot of add-on airports. This is the International Pier, which makes use of a number of the aforementioned default jetways. If anything, I would say that this pier looks better than the others, and I think that's because the facade doesn't have as much detail in it, so the slightly low resolution textures are less of an issue. The main terminal building looks pretty good. The modelling is accurate, if not the most detailed I've ever seen, and the textures look pretty nice. Again, they're not very high resolution, but they are nicely weathered and the colour matching is pretty accurate. Aside from the upper parts of the jetways, this ground control tower and the staircase up to it also have transparent glass, and both look pretty good from the outside. The inside of the ground control tower is a little bit disappointing. We have some interior modelling, but unfortunately we have no floor, so all of this is just floating in the air. The main control tower looks somewhat better. Again, we have transparent glass and interior modelling, but here we have a floor and some animated people. While the furniture is still floating a little bit and the interior detail is pretty blurry, the impression from outside is pretty good, and that's what counts. The peripheral buildings have been very nicely modelled, and they've been textured to a similar standard as the main terminal buildings. I'm particularly impressed with this British Airways hangar. This lattice work on the roof looks absolutely fantastic, and that must have taken a very long time to get right. The buildings at the General Aviation apron are accurately modelled, but they are let down by the texturing, which is decidedly dodgy looking. Just have a look at these drain pipes here. The Gamma Aviation hangars, on the other hand, look very nice indeed. They're both nicely modelled and nicely textured, and the signage is very crisp indeed. The airport fire station and what I believe is some kind of maintenance depot next to it both look very nice as well, and the quality of the 3D vehicles that are included is pretty high. The textures aren't the crispest, but they look pretty realistic nonetheless. The fencing used around the airport looks pretty realistic, but there are areas where it just stops abruptly or starts either floating or sinking into the ground, unfortunately. Unlike with previous UK2000 sceneries, this one doesn't offer the option to install with or without static aircraft. We don't have any airliners included, but we do have GA planes, bizjets and helicopters included on these remote aprons. The quality of these models is variable, but overall they do a good job of bringing a bit of life to the remote areas of the airport. A good amount of detail has been included in the landside, with some buildings around the airport quite nicely modelled, including this Holiday Inn, and the actual airport entrance itself is full of life. As you'll notice, we've got parked vehicles, we've got realistic signage, and there are even some passengers out the front of the airport. Unfortunately, this scene is let down a little bit by the blurry default ground textures. Talking of which, let's have a look at the airside ground textures. Having looked at the Google and Bing satellite imagery, I would say that these are not particularly accurate. The materials used and their colours are fairly close in places, and less so in others. Around the domestic pier here, for example, the real airport appears to have concrete slabs, whereas UK2000's version has a dark tarmac instead. All the ground textures are a little bit clean in my opinion. The real airport looks very dirty with lots of spills and marks, and we don't have any of that here. The taxiways appear to make use of the default satellite imagery, and this really doesn't look good at all. They are very blurry, as you can see, and we've got some bleeding through of the taxiway lines from the satellite image, which just looks dreadful and is not something I would expect from an airport that costs nearly £20. The ground markings are not that impressive either. I think that this taxiway centerline is from the default airport, because if you look at the satellite imagery, it should have black borders like these custom stand markings have. These white lines appear to be pretty accurate, but they are quite low resolution and we do have a bit of aliasing around the edges. The runway doesn't look great either, I'm afraid. While the markings appear to be accurate, that's where the resemblance to the real thing ends. The materials used are incorrect and the textures are quite low resolution and blurry. The grassy areas look good though, as do the taxiway signs, which have been nicely modelled and they're nice and clear. The night lighting at this airport is not too bad at all. It's rather spoilt by the magic floating orbs, but I don't think there's anything developers can do to remove those. It's something that Asobo needs to fix. So it's just unfortunate. The stuff that UK2000 has done is pretty good. The floodlights look realistic, as do the pools of light that they create on the ground. The opaque window textures are among the better of those I've seen. They're perhaps slightly too bright, but nonetheless they do create a pretty convincing impression of a terminal building that's lit from within. That said, there are a number of windows that aren't lit at all, and that to me spoils the effect somewhat. I don't believe that in reality these windows here would not be lit at night. The landside entrance to the airport doesn't look amazing because there is a complete lack of flood lighting, but the textures again are pretty good other than their resolution. The runway and taxiway lighting are pretty good, but unfortunately the remote aprons, the Gamma, Juliet and GA aprons, have no flood lighting whatsoever, so they are in complete darkness by night. Here's Glasgow in the rain, and the ground textures, slightly inaccurate though they are, do look pretty good when they're wet. And here's Glasgow in the snow. It all looks a little bit odd, as you can see. We've got a thick blanket of snow over this part of the apron, and not a single snowflake on this part here. The taxiways and the runway look quite good with a thin covering of snow which is not uniform, but unfortunately because of the harsh transitions and the sharp edges, this isn't a particularly realistic looking airport in the snow. So what's the verdict? Well, put it this way, I was hopeful that UK2000 sceneries were on the up. Inverness was definitely an improvement on Luton, and I was hoping that this would be a further improvement on Inverness, but honestly, it isn't. There are certainly some good points. The modelling is pretty good, the building textures, while pretty low resolution for a 2021 scenery, look quite realistic from an aircraft cockpit. There's a good amount of ground clutter and some nice little details included that other developers may not have bothered with. In spite of its shortcomings, the airport has a nice, believable atmosphere, and this is something that UK2000 has always been good at. But fundamentally, in my opinion, it's not okay to charge £18.48 for an airport with broken localisers, non-functioning jetways, and inaccurate, blurry, and in some places default, ground textures. If this airport was for sale for £8 or £9, I'd say go for it. But unless you're particularly keen to fly to Glasgow and don't mind paying over the odds for a mediocre scenery add-on, I sadly can't recommend it. So there you have it. I hope this review has been useful. If it has, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon here on Philbert Flies. Bye bye.